Greetings, Dr. Elder, and to anyone else that may watch this video. This is my review of the book, Paul the Progressive, the Compassionate Christian's Guide to Reclaiming the Apostle as an Ally by Eric C. Smith. So first of all, what the author is trying to do here is take a lot of misconceptions about the writings of Paul that people have used to not really like Paul and turn those around and try to help people develop a different thinking. Many people have said that they have hated Paul because he is a misogynist, a homophobe, anti-Semitic, a prude, a slavery apologist, a xenophobe, and a debt and guilt monger. And these are the things that the author is trying to have a different outlook and different ideas about. He gives us a couple of rules as we're talking about Paul. One is that there are a lot of things that Paul did not write that his name has been attributed to. There are only 7 books, according to the author, that modern scholars agree on that Paul did write. And they are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Theologians, and Philemon. Second is that he wants us to understand that Paul was not a systematic theologian. He was not writing a textbook on how we should worship, on the background of it, and all of those things. Paul was more concerned about addressing a particular reason or occasion that he saw to a specific group of people. And the other thing is that Paul was very adamant that he thought that the end times, that Christ's second coming, was around the corner. And so he needed to do all that he could to help as many people as possible know the truth about Christ and to be able to live in heaven. He's worried about people's eternity. The other thing is that a lot of the things this author talks about are part of the new perspective that you, Dr. Elder, had talked about in our class. So I won't belabor about what the new perspective is, as we should be able to understand that. A lot of texts, the texts that are not attributed to Paul, are pseudo-Pauline. Well, what does that mean? It means that after Paul's death, a lot of people were trying to continue to get people's attention. A lot of people listened to Paul, and a lot of people felt that Paul knew what he was talking about, and people listened. Unfortunately, these folks would at times use Paul's words and write as he did, but then add in their own take or slant to things. And this is why Paul has gotten such a bad rep with the areas that I've already mentioned. So the author asks that we keep these things in mind as we move forward with the different categories that he has. He addresses Paul as the misogynist first. Again, he's saying that many of these passages were not written by Paul. But first, the main text that he uses that people say Paul is against women comes from Ephesians and Colossians. What the author wants people to know that, number one, after Paul died, as the church grew, it grew too big for the home churches and the private services that people were having. And so as the church grew, it needed to put some things in place as it grew. And the folks helping to organize things were using a patriarchal system in order to try to organize who was doing what, who could preach, who took care of things. And so sometimes that can be viewed in a negative light towards women. And at times it has been used to keep women out of the ministry. But what did Paul say about women? Well, first of all, he said that marriage was an equal partnership. And this comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Men and women had an equal part in respecting each other and the duties of a marriage. Next, Paul recognized that women were praying and prophesying in the church. And, there are many, many women that he actually mentions in his writing. Phoebe, Prisca, Junia, Chloe, Tryphenia, the mother of Rufus, and the list goes on of the women that Paul venerates, that he says, that these are good people. These are believers, and they know what they're talking about, so listen to them. The other thing is that Paul in Galatians chapter 3 says there's no longer Jew or Gentile, male or female. He didn't see roles in the church as male or female roles. Paul saw things as whoever has the gift needs to move forward and do that. So that is how the author addresses the person, the church using Paul saying that women should not preach. Now, Paul is the homophobe. He has a lot of support here for this. There are a lot of clobber texts that the author describes as being used over the years to say that homosexuals are a bad thing, and that you need to be healed or cured of it, and it's not right, and those people can't be in the churches. It's been a source of pain and isolation for millions, he says. They come from Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, and from Jude. One of the issues that he has is the English translation of these. Now, first of all, the one thing that we learn in exegesis is that there is no way to totally take who we are and the experiences that we have had out of our perception when we are reading the Bible. And so even when we're going to the original texts and we are translating it into English, our views, no matter how hard we try to keep those out of what we are doing, color the words that we choose and how the texts are used. Specifically, he mentions the Greek word arsenkoites. He said it's just a difficult word to translate into English in the first place. Many have taken their view of homosexuality and placed it on there. I was curious about this and went to Step Bible, and he's right. This Greek word actually means external intercourse, nakedness, lewdness, lust, and indecency. It says nothing about homosexuality. Paul was focusing on the morality and the idolatry of the Gentiles when he wrote these texts. He's trying to protect people from being abused and being exploited because of the time that he wrote, because of the cultural hierarchy and unfortunately the advantage that people in the higher systems took of those below them. He's trying to protect people when he is talking about sexual immorality. Next is Paul as the anti-Semitic. Paul was not an anti-Semitic. Paul was Jewish. He was born Jewish, he was raised Jewish, and he always was Jewish. There was no such thing as Christianity that he could convert to. What Paul tries to do the entire time that he is writing is, number one, help Gentiles understand how they need to act, who they need to be, without the benefit of growing up Jewish. Paul has a great love for Israel. And so when he's addressing these things and coming out strongly against Jewish practices, he's not talking necessarily about the practices themselves. He's talking about the morality of the people who are practicing them. And you have to remember that not everybody that was Jewish practiced this way. Not everyone that was Jewish was horribly awful and thought Gentiles shouldn't be included. And Paul, again, he thinks it's the end times, and he is trying to get the message home in the most succinct way that he can, that it is your eternity that is at stake here. The next thing that the author tries to address is Paul the prude. And again, he's trying to look at the immorality of the Gentiles. The Gentiles did not grow up with the laws about just practices and how to treat one another with the Ten Commandments that the Jews have. And so they don't really have a rubric to draw from. And the problem, especially in Romans and in the societies around there, is sexual behavior. There are a lot of people are operating with no guidelines or boundaries. And their sexual behavior is an idol. And so Paul is not being a prude, but Paul is saying, look, you need to think about who you have just given your life to. And you need to think about this new community that you belong to. He's really concerned about introducing what the author calls a permeability to the church body. Once it's deemed okay for one person to behave this way or to engage in these kind of practices, then more and more are going to think that it is okay. And so Paul is really worried about the condition of the community, especially the Gentiles. Next, we move on to Paul, the slavery apologist. This goes back to the pseudo-Pauline texts. Paul was not writing about these things. And again, Paul is operating in what he thinks are the end times. So he is not concerned about the long haul of people's social situations. He is more concerned about your eternity because he thinks you're not going to be here long. He doesn't really speak about the rights or wrongs of slavery. He's speaking about a personal salvation of a person and where they're going to end up in eternity. The author goes back to Galatians chapter 3, where we're talking about there's no longer slave or free. We talked about that earlier. There is no longer man or woman, Jew or Greek, or Jew or Gentile. Paul does not endorse slavery. Paul doesn't talk about it at all. He's trying to talk to these people who are slaves, telling them that there is a better tomorrow. Now let's move on to Paul the xenophobe. This is concerning sort of the colonial power and the fact that there are people who see themselves as unimpeachable. And these people, unfortunately, have used what words have been attributed to Paul in order to bolster their claims. But this is interesting because Paul himself was a colonial subject. Why would he speak about the oppression of others when he himself was a person who was being oppressed? It just doesn't make sense. The author again appeals to the idea that Paul is talking to Gentiles, and he was trying to advise people on who to follow and how far to follow them, especially the leaders of the synagogues. Finally, let's talk about Paul, the debt and guilt monger. This isn't talking about money. This is talking about where we're going to spend eternity and our salvation. Tradition has taught us that salvation is a very individual thing, and there has been a very low, the author calls it a low anthropology, that we're all sinners and we're all going to go to hell. It's almost a fear-mongering. However, the new idea with the new perspective, there's more, he calls it a high anthropology. It's looking for the good in everyone, and it's trying to make sure that there is a more inclusive idea, that all have the benefits of God available to them if they repent and believe. And so instead of using this fear of damnation in order to bring people to an individual salvation, it's more about a community, the community life, the community as a whole, and bringing folks into the fold to live a better life together. I saw a lot of strengths in this book, especially with the misogynist, homophobe, and anti-Semitic sections. There's substantial support. There are scriptural supports. He gives actually translations of actual words that, in his view, have been translated incorrectly over the years. He talks a lot about the contextualization of where Paul was and who he was talking to, and that these were letters. They were letters to specific people. He was not writing a book on theology or how to follow Jesus. I also liked that they addressed current issues. This author was very good at addressing current issues, and bringing out, was not afraid to talk about how the church has persecuted people who act differently. I did feel that there were some weaknesses for the remainder of the passages about Paul being a prude, a slavery apologist, and a xenophobe. I didn't feel like there was as much of support. They all sort of shared the same reasons about why these ideas were not Paul's. Those include Paul not writing the books of where they are mentioned, and Paul being more interested about the end times. However, I did think that they were compelling enough to help people start to think differently. Overall, I would recommend this book. I really like this book. And I have to tell you, I was prepared not to like this book. I was prepared and geared up with my own thoughts on things, my own tradition. I come from PCUSA, was born and raised there. I'm looking for ordination there. This gentleman, in his biography, it describes himself as contemporary and progressive. And, those two words have really gotten a bad rap in the religious world, I think. And I really was being prepared for there to be really some outlandish and weird things. But what I found was myself identifying with this author. He is young, maybe a little bit younger than me, but for a scholar, was maybe on the younger side than I personally am used to. He also, he grew up United Methodist, and I started my journey in seminary in the United Methodist Church. And there are a lot of things about the United Methodist Church that I like. The examples that he gave of his life and in ministry tied in so well with the points that he was trying to make that I didn't feel like he was like, oh, let me talk about myself. They weren't him talking about himself. They were him drawing you into situations that today, like that right now, I can identify with, and that I have dealt with in my life and in other people's lives. I have to say that I would really recommend this book to not only those who are new to ministry, but those who have been in ministry for a while. And I really think that it would be useful to help understand perhaps a different perspective of things from some quote unquote traditional thoughts about things that we're dealing with today. I feel that the church has really alienated some folks because of some of the things that he addresses. Homosexuals particularly are on my brain and on my heart and on my mind, have been alienated. And Paul has been used to do that. So that's all. I really could go on and say more about the wonderful things that we have to gain from this book. But I think that you get the idea. I thank you so much for allowing me to come to you and talk about it. And I'm so glad that this was one of the books that was required to read. Thanks, Dr. Elder.